welcome back. This one is going to be a little bit of confusing / explanations of the Atavism system, how messages and everything are handled between the client to server, to get us ready for actually creating the systems and understanding what we're actually doing. It's easier to kind of get an idea of what's going on before we actually try to make it do anything to understand what the system's doing. So in this case, we're going to assume that you're using the demo, you haven't changed a whole lot of anything, and you go to a crafting station, you tell the server, I want to craft 10 widgets. What the heck is going to happen? Well, the way the normal servers work, including Atavism, is it has a server and a client, but the difference between this is that there's a whole bunch of servers. Looking at the Atavism system, you have several servers that are running all the time, and think about this as you're walking into a room and there are 10 people there, and instead of calling out a name of who you're talking to, you just start calling out instructions. None of the people in the room have any idea who you're talking to or who's supposed to be listening or doing any information. This is where you have to really understand what are called hooks. So the way that the messaging hooks works is your client, in this case, is asking the system to fire up the crafting system that you're requesting to make 10 widgets. Your system then calls on a hook that is a message that's going to contain a hook, I should say. And then on the server side, inside this room with all these people, one of these people has been assigned this hook. And anytime that sees a message show up with that hook, they know that this message is specifically intended for them. So we're going to cover the hooks and the filters and all that stuff later, but just know that Atavism already does this for you, so it makes things a whole heck of a lot easier. If you've used things like the Mirror or Photon or any of those things, you know that it generally comes with a very wide variety of things you can do, because you have to code every little smidgen of the data in there, how to handle the messages, how to direct the messages, parsing it, and everything else. Atavism does all this for you, so it really makes things easy. So we're not going to mess with the client side right now. We're just going to mess with the server side. And I've already got Eclipse and everything set up to pull up what we're going to be looking at. Now, with this system, your client sends a message and says, I want to craft 10 widgets. This message is then sent to the server, and it's going to end up in the crafting client Java. This is the file that basically reads the data from the client and determines what it's supposed to do with that data. So in this case, your client sends a message to the crafting system, and now inside this crafting system, it's going to set up all this information about the call, and it's going to come through and figure out through all these things what it's supposed to do. These are basically all the setups, things you can ask for. And if we scroll on through here a bit, these are the hooks. So in this case, we're telling it we want to craft an item, and that's the hook. So whenever our client sends a message, it says message type crafting craft item. This is asking the crafting system to craft an item, and this is what handles making that item. So in this case, a crafting.craft item. So in this case, it's saying the crafting system handles this. So the message then goes into what's called a crafting plugin. This is the crafting system itself. So whenever you see calling for crafting, it's going to the crafting plugin. If it's pulling, for example, we'll hop into the guild system, we'll look at it. Whenever it's coming into the guild plugin, this is guild.whatever. This is saying, hey, I've received this message, and this is who's going to handle it. So in this case, we're going to fire up the crafting plugin. And if we scroll all the way up to the top of it here, go back into our client here, we're looking for something called craft item. This is the method or function that it's asking Java to execute inside this server. So crafting.craft item, we care about the craft item. So if we come in here, we look right at the top here, right at the very top where it starts loading up all the imports and everything else. Well, look at that. There's our call right there for the craft item. So this is the filter saying, yes, I can handle this. This is the message I'm looking for, which is the message that was sent to it in here. So when it fires up, it's basically going to run through this filter and see, can I handle this information that's being sent to me? Did you set this up? Yada, yada, yada. And it's going to filter out these types of messages. This is the one we're looking for, and if we scroll down to the next section, these are the actual hooks. So this is saying every time you hear that message, this is what you want to do. So you want to run the craft item hook function. So if we scroll on down here and we look for that, we'll see what the server's actually going to start doing with this information. So we scroll on through and we see that the crafting system handles the resource nodes and all sorts of other stuff as well. So that's where all these filters and everything come out to separate, because sometimes things are kind of mixed on what everything does. But in this case, this is the class we're looking for, class craft item hook from the hook system. And this is where the checks start to happen on the server side of what it's supposed to be doing with this information based on the message that you sent. So here it pulls out the message, and here it's going to start pulling the pieces out of the message. The subject is your player ID, and then out of it it's going to pull the recipe ID, the station that you're using, the recipe ID, which is one of these is basically the name of it, and one of these is basically the number of it. And then it's going to make a log. These are the important things when you're learning the system, is the developers, Dragon Sand, really made these things easy to read, which is a rarity. And you can really not even read most of the code and just scroll through there and read these logs and see what it's doing to try to find your problems that you're trying to edit. So in this case, it's saying, hey, you started the crafting recipe, this is the station you're at, this is what you're trying to do, and this is who's doing it, so you can pull this stuff up in your logs. Then I'm going to start the actual checks. Can I actually do this? Well, first, is the player dead? Well, you can't craft if you're dead, so if you're dead, skip it, return an error. Hey, you can't do this while you're dead. Leave the process. Whenever you see a return, is basically saying just stop the rest of the code, abort here. And then it's going to ask, are you busy? Are you doing something other than the crafting? Are you, for example, in combat or whatever? Then it's going to check, are you mounted? Are you on a horse or dragon or whatever, and is a system flag to stop you from crafting while you're in a mounted position? In that case, it also fails. If all of that checks out, it continues and comes down here, and okay, you're now ready to start the crafting system, and it's going to ask, are we doing a grid-based or standard? And it's going to basically pull the information out of the server settings. Are you using the grid-based crafting system or not? In our case, most of the demo stuff is not, so it's going to fire up this one instead. It's going to pass 4 variables to a function called doStandardCraft. If we scroll on through here and we look for that, here's our stuff, and it's calling these 4 variables. It's passing the message and the basic information out of it, and it's going to begin logging through it. And this is where the debug logs come in handy. It basically tells you each step that it's going and what it's actually doing, and I don't have to read most of the code. I could just kind of scroll through and just look at the messages. So in this case, for example, I'll just look for a message in here, In this case, this is returning the time. So this has to do with the timing. Okay, that's easy enough. The user does not have the required components, so then the part just before that must be checking the inventory. And in turn, you're just coming through here and looking at all of these types of things. So if we start up here at the top of it, it's calling this up, starting at the process, getting all the information from the server, setting up the stuff, and it's keeping a log of every step that it's going, and then saying if there is a valid recipe supplied, check the station. The stations don't match the recipe, abort. There's a return saying, okay, the conditions are no longer met, just abort the system and go back. There's no point in processing anymore. Otherwise, return the message that says, okay, this part checked out with the recipe. Let's move on to the next part. Then it's going to start pulling in all the crafting components and basically checking, getting ready to check your inventory versus what the recipe itself actually asks for. And then it's going to pop up here and it this is what this recipe requires. Now it wants to check your skill level. Going to look at your player skill level versus basically the recipe skill level. Are you able to do it? Yes or no? And then it comes through here and basically says if your skill is below the recipe skill, you can't make this, and again, abort. Otherwise, I'll return and say that your skill is okay, and you're ready to progress to the next one, and now we fire up this one. Now you see this little dot here, this is one of those integration things, why you always look in here as to what these things are calling, because in this case, the inventory system, well, that stores your inventory. A crafting system has no idea who your player is or what your player has in their inventory, so it's going to ask the inventory system, what does this player have? This is what the player needs, and this is how many they need, does it match, compare everything, yada yada yada, and it's going to start coming through and looking at your inventory. So first it's going to look at your inventory's info. It's going to see if any of your stuff has bonus modifications for the timing, and it's going to start setting all this stuff up for your time changes. So you have an outfit or whatever that increases your crafting time, it'll add all these things to it. It'll debug out the log here and say, hey, this is basically your new crafting time that was used. These are kind of confusing, so we're definitely going to skip that for a later part of the tutorial. And these are the more interesting things that you'll love about Atavism, because this is another one of those on like Photon, Mirror, you have to set all this stuff up. Atavism's already put it in here for handling its own messaging system. You don't have to know how to code any of this, it does it all for you. It's adding a property, so props, and it's putting into those properties these variables. And it's just going straight on down the line here, and then it's going to call out for another message. It's going to send this message to the player. It's a new targeted message through the world manager, sending a message to the player, and then it's going to send the values of those props. So in this case, it's coming through and it's calculating all these checks, and now that it's figured out, for example, the time, this is how in the bottom client, on the client side above your toolbar, when you start activating, for example, harvesting or crafting, you get that little scroll bar. This is basically sending the message to the client saying what that timer should be set to. Then you have basically sending the actual message. This is preparing the message. This is sending the message out, and then it's going to prepare to actually create the recipe. In this case, it's going to go ahead and fire up a new crafting task for that recipe on your player, what you're making, and so on and so forth. We can see there's 4 variables. You got your recipe, the player ID, the recipe ID, and a 1. So in that case, we're basically just looking through here, and that's the system that's going to fire up. That fires up the coordinated effect system. Basically, this is all the checks and balances that it's made before it's gone into the actual crafting system. Then it prepares the final message and sends it off, starts at the coordinated effects. If any of these conditions failed, it will basically come in here and say you didn't meet the requirements. In this case, the last check was out of the inventory management. So if that system fails and none of these things execute, it's going to say, put up a log, why it failed, you didn't have the components in your inventory for that recipe, abort, done, doesn't work. And then it just returns the messages around saying, hey, you didn't make it, you couldn't do this, and it'll send the message to the client either way on success or on failure. If it's a success calls, this is the message it sends. If it's a failure, then this is the message that it sends. But just before this is where it's actually calling the thing. And that's this part here. It's creating a new crafting task. So where is this? Well, it doesn't have a point or anything in it. So is it somewhere inside this system? Well, this is creating another one of them. You just scroll on through here and see if the system's in here somewhere. No, we'll just scroll through and it's not in here. Well, where else could it possibly be? Is it above? We'll scroll on through. And I don't really see it nowhere. So if we come down here and we find it, and we copy this, maybe I'm missing it. Is it somewhere in here and I just didn't see it? Well, put it in there, find it. Well, I'm finding a bunch of references to it, but I'm not finding it. It's finished the search, didn't show up. Well, what about back in our client? Is it in here somewhere? So we could try it again, try that, put it back in there. It's also not here. Well, where could it be? Now this is where it kind of gets a little confusing, is because some of these things are kind of in other systems. So it's not in the crafting system. Well, where else could it possibly be? Well, if I just come in here and do up a search in here, I could probably find it. But in turn, this is how the system basically works for you finding all your stuff. You're basically running through and just following the messages. In this case, it's basically firing up the crafting client for receiving messages from the client. It's going through the plugin to actually execute these things. But if you look at stuff like these, sometimes you'll get lost and confused as to finding them, but they're usually not too hard. And if you just kind of looked around, if, for example, you were to compare these things, a crafting task versus a crafting item, they're not quite the same thing, but all your stuff is in here, and you can basically come through and look around and find the different things. These are the things, ignore these aren't part of yours, these are things we're working on with our advanced skilling system. But it's basically in here that's handling all these things. Not all of them are a plugin like these. These are only the plugin objects. What about inside of here? Would any of this stuff seem like it is a valid place? Well, I see stuff for databases and randomizing stuff. You've got all these different places where the stuff can be. Could it maybe be one of these? You kind of just tinker around and try to follow it. I generally just cheat, go into the file system itself, assuming I can actually remember where I put it. Actually, I have no idea because I got them copied all over the place. But I could just pop it into here. Now look at that. There's a file called crafting task inside of objects. So look at that. There's the objects. So I can open this up, scroll on down, and sure enough, there's the crafting task. So in this case, we don't want these things open because I already got enough windows open. Close out some of the stuff. So in this case, the plugin is telling it to make a new crafting task, which just happens to have its own file inside of the Aegis objects. If you look over here, we see this is passing 4 variables. So we just come in here, and now we just need to know what it's doing. Is it firing up this one? There's 1, 2. Hey, look at that. The first one is what it's creating. It takes 4 variables. We're passing. If I go to the right one, we're passing 4 variables. So this is the system it's then running. It's already done the checks and balances to make sure it's able to do it. Now it's coming in here and actually firing up the task itself. Just taking all that information, you can follow it on through here. It's pulling the items out of your inventory. It's doing all your bonus mods. And then it's sending out the messages. In this case, it's basically just setting everything up ready to go. And hey, your crafting time is this. This is how long it's going to take. And it just goes on through and completes it. You can see down here there's another crafting task versus this crafting task. This one takes 4 variables. And this one takes several more. But in turn, we know that's not the one we're using, simply because that's not the one we asked for. We sent 4 variables. This is the one that uses those 4 variables. So this is the one that's handling our system. So where does it go? How does it end? You're basically just looking through here and pulling out the different types of information of what is actually going on. And this is how you can take any system from the Atavism system and really just kind of tear it apart, follow it through the code, and you can make any changes that you want. What if I don't want this system? What if I don't want bonus mods or anything else like that to the timing system? Well, there's all the code right here to handle it. You can change whatever you want. The same goes with the combat system and everything else. If you want to see how the combat systems are handled, start by looking at their plugin. So you got your bonus stats, you got your chat systems, you got your combat systems. This is how the combat systems are handled. If you want to know where it's at, what it's doing, how are you coming up with these numbers, then this is a good place to look at the code. You want to basically just scroll through here and look at the headers of what it's trying to do. This has to do with the instance, yada yada yadas. You're just basically going through and looking at all of these types of things to see what's going on for what you're trying to look at. The easiest way to see what's going to be fired is if you know what messages you're sending. Get out of the search menu. If we look at our actual server system, and you come under binary, or not binary, but you look under configs, under the world, if you look in here, you'll see a very interesting thing, and you're in here somewhere. I got so many of them. World messages. So in this case, these are the messages that the system's currently set up to listen to. So if you don't know what's calling on something, you can always come in here and see where it's being called for. And generally they're pretty nice and put in nice little labels of where things are. In this case, you can see all the stuff to do with the inventory is separated into one area. So everything to do with it is nice and neat together. When you scroll down, these are anything to do with the abilities and the questing system, and there's all the stuff to do with the combat. So if you ever want to know what something is being called for, this is the file you'd look at to see what to look at. This is applying an effect to something, this is removing the effect of something, whether you get knocked out, mounting and dismounting, buffs, everything in here is basically what's determining stuff. What if you want to know how the AoE is making its targeting? Well, there it is. Get AoE targets. It tells you all of the stuff and what it does. What if you want to change what happens if you're in combat and you log out because you're losing? There's the system that handles what happens in those cases. Come in here and edit whatever you want with it. You have full control to change absolutely anything you want about the system. And that is one of the best points to Atavism, is look at all these messages that are already set up for you. It's already broken a lot of the stuff down to make it as easy for you as you can to get started, though it is going to be rather overwhelming getting started. This is a lot of files, and you look at, I ain't even got half of these things open. Now there's a lot of different systems in here, but don't get overwhelmed because you don't have to mess with everything to change one thing. If you want to change the combat system, then you just need to mess around with the combat system. That's where the damage calculations and everything will be referenced and handled and everything else, so just stick with it. And by all means, follow their logs. Every time they do their stuff, Atavism, Dragonsane was nice enough to put in these little log debug messages to tell you exactly what it just did. So if you were looking for how the weapon cooldown was done, well, this is telling you, hey, I just finished that process. So everything then above that has to do with that system. And then you know where to look just by reading on the comments. It will help you diagnose the code a lot quicker. It will help you get a lot further along, simply because you don't have to read all this mumble jumble and try to figure out what the heck is all this stuff. Just read the log. The log tells you what it just did, and then you know the last loop, that's what that system was all about. You can just run your search. So, okay, I don't know where to look in here. What if I'm looking for damage? So I could just look at damage. Hey, look at that, the damage type. work out the damage to be dealt to the players. Ooh, look at this. Looks like something to do with maybe PvP because it's talking about damage to the player, or maybe this is where the mob is hitting. So we look up there. No, this is if you're falling off of something, and well, this determines your damage. So we can just scroll on through here, looking on around at these things, damage modifiers and everything else. All this stuff is here. You basically just gotta look around for what you're looking for. None of them's hard, and quite often if you just scroll to the bottom or the top, you get all these little basically identifiers that you can use for looking at things. So usually starting here with these static strings, these will reference the names of different things that you can directly look for. So if you are looking for things to do with dealt, this is the ability health dealt to the mob, but this is for an ability, not for example melee or whatever. But you can come through here and just look at all the stuff. So hey, there's the damage dealt modifiers. There's the damage taken modifiers. And then you could just simply scroll through and find those things by using what it's basically just told you to look for. So if we look for that, we can basically just keep digging on around through these systems, find it, and there's all your little IDs and stuff. So everything's in here, you just gotta basically look around for it and poke at it. Start at the beginning with the client. If I go into the plugins again, no, that's the crafting, I want the combat. Start at the client system for whatever system you're looking for, and then just scroll down until it gets into the hooks. So as you scroll on through, these are setting everything up and doing all their stuff for it, but you're basically just looking for all of these messages, types of messages, hooks, and everything else that are associated with that system, and that will basically tell you exactly where you need to look for all your stuff. So we're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and we can start to see some of them are in here, but I'm just skipping over a whole bunch of them. But down here is where you're basically looking at. These are the types of messages that this system handles, and then this is who handles it. So not everything is, for example, this particular client. So in this case, this is one that's not being handled by the combat system. And if you read it, it kind of gives you an idea of what's going to handle it. And this is the message type regen, health, and mana. That's not really a combat system, but the message is still received by the combat system, and then tells you which system fires it up. And so you can use that to just dig around, see all of the stuff, and see how everything works by just looking at the messages and the hooks. So the next time we get this started, we're actually going to create a fresh project from scratch in Unity 2021. And I would show you the exact version if I had it running. I guess I could just open it. And while it's loading up here, so we will be using 2021.3.15 F1. And again, this is with the Atavism X6 that we'll be working with. And this is the actual project we're going to be remaking from scratch. And it should be a very interesting thing. And you can see I was actually in there a little while ago messing with some of the code, preparing for some of the stuff. So the next tutorial we put out there is going to be setting up the Unity project for core, and then setting the server up for core, because by default the server is configured not for core, but instead it is configured for basically running through and running with the demo data. So we'll need to change this system over to actually work with the demo data on basically a whole different system, deleting the demo data out so that our database is nice and empty. For example, in this case, this isn't with the demo data, but as an example, if I pull up my skills, we've got 165 skills in here. There's a lot of stuff in here. So we're going to be deleting all this, and when it's all done, this should be 0. So yeah, fun stuff. But we'll be getting into that on the next one. I will try to put it out tomorrow, and we will kind of poke at it. It'll probably be a while till we get into the actual Aegis coding. We're going to start with setting up the Unity project, and basically the server side, getting it into core mode. We're going to be setting up the UMA system, setting up the character customization aspects for that so that we can actually make a character and get into it. And then we're going to actually go through and start working on lists. This is basically a breakdown explanation of how I'm looking at the new professions and skilling systems and how I'm wanting them to work for this project. And I think that you're going to find that it's a very complicated system, and it should definitely add a lot of spice to basically the copy paste that most of the developers with most of the MMO systems, not just Atavism, but most of everybody, are just using everybody else's stuff and not making their own. We will be keeping our same classes. Don't worry about the languages. This is supposed to be, as the logo kind of says, Viking Nordic stuff. So yeah, we kind of use some other slang and all that kind of stuff, but these are the humans, the light elves, and basically the cat people. And all that stuff is already in, ready to go, and yeah, such fun stuff. So we're going to basically be going through and setting up the character creator stuff. Then we're probably going to work on editing the database itself. Once the database is set up to handle the new data, we're going to begin working on the actual scripting, which I've already got started on into these things. I'm not really done a whole lot, but I've got things ready to get it going. And I've already worked on those and a couple of the other little things, playing with things and testing stuff out. But they're basically all in here. I just got to get them out of here and into their own little plugin. So, yay. So hopefully this was informative enough for you to understand how the messages works, because we're going to be doing a lot of work with the messages inside of Aegis. So hopefully you guys stick around for the next run, and we'll see you next time.